Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our fun reading of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We are dealing here with Elizabeth Bennet. There are other main characters in the book, but for a large chunk of it, the main character is Elizabeth Bennet, the spirited second daughter of the master of Longbourn, a house and an estate and a farm and servants and furniture that is all entailed away from her or her older sister Jane. Legally, they cannot inherit it when their father, Mr. Bennet, dies. It instead goes to his nearest male relative, Mr. Collins, a worm of a man that they've met and that they haven't liked at all, and that Elizabeth actually turned down an offer for marriage. And in these latest chapters that we're reading, Elizabeth has lost some people at Longbourn. Her sister Jane, pining for the missing Mr. Bingley, has taken an offer from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, to go and spend a little time at the Gardiner's house in Gracechurch Street in London. So she's not there anymore. And also, Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte Lucas, is not there anymore because she actually did accept Mr. Collins' hand in marriage and moved to the next county over. Not easy visiting distance. Need to make a trip out of it. Can't just pop over like Charlotte Lucas always did for, we presume, the whole of their lives. Not to mention the fact that their friendship had been irreparably compromised by the fact that Elizabeth could not hide from Charlotte her disgust at Charlotte's decision to marry a man she doesn't love, doesn't even like, simply for the security of an establishment, of a house, and a steady income and public respectability. Like I said last time, Charlotte Lucas knows that she has lost the high regard of her friend. And like I said last time, that's hard. That's really hard. If you're in a close, intimate friendship and that element of it comes into question, lots of other elements of a close, intimate friendship can come into question, and the friendship can just trundle right on, heal from them, maybe even get stronger. But that's tough. In a real friendship, you've got to have the mutual feeling that you like each other, that you admire each other. And that is gone now. So that's awkward, and Charlotte is also gone, and Elizabeth has missed her. So when it's proposed, when Charlotte Lucas's father and her mother, and also they propose that Charlotte Lucas's father and her sister go to visit her, go to pay a visit to her in the spring, in the early spring, when the roads are nice and firm, Elizabeth goes along, especially since the trip is choreographed in such a way that before they get to Hunsford, before they get to Mr. Collins' home, Charlotte's new home, they will visit Jane in London. So they do that. So Elizabeth is out on the road now, meeting with the people that she used to spend every day with them. And that's where we are now with chapter 28. I should warn you, these are still connecting tissue chapters. There are major things coming, of course. It doesn't look it, right? It doesn't look like there are. Charlotte Lucas, for good or ill, is settled and married. Jane Bennet, for good or ill, is now getting over what was obviously just a shallow fling on the part of Mr. Bingley. Mr. Wickham, the dashing, beautiful Mr. Wickham, who was paying Elizabeth all kinds of attention and getting it in return to the extent that Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's very worldly wise aunt, had to warn her about falling in love. It had to be that obvious. But that's over too. Mr. Wickham has set his sights on a young woman who is now become suddenly very wealthy. So it looks like the novel is over. Aside from these travels, and maybe one travel more, because when Elizabeth is visiting the Gardiners, Mrs. Gardiner proposes that they take her along on a pleasure trip that they're going to do, a vacation that they're going to take. So that's totally occupying Elizabeth's mind, but that's just keeping a journal, writing letters, maybe doing a little watercolor. That's not a plot. It looks like the major elements of the book have stopped. That is wrong, but it looks that way, and that's the kind of chapter that we're dealing with here too. So just to prepare yourself, there aren't going to be any velociraptor attacks. So this is chapter 28. Every object in the next day's journey was new and interesting to Elizabeth, and her spirits were in a state of enjoyment, for she had seen her sister looking so well as to banish all fear for her health, and the prospect of her northern tour was a constant source of delight. So the next day's journey is now they are going to Hunsford. They did the trip to London. They went to the theater, distributed presents, saw Jane, and Jane seems to be bearing up well. And Mrs. Gardner thinks, well, she has down moments. She's definitely hurt by this, but she's getting better. It's not in her nature to let this affect her forever, so you probably need not worry. And also, another thing that's buoying up Elizabeth is that she keeps daydreaming about this vacation that's coming up, this big trip. How wonderful. So she's not set upon by the idea of seeing Mr. Collins again. When they left the high road for the lane to Hunsford, every eye was in search of the parsonage, and every turning expected to bring it into view. The paling of Rosings Park was their boundary on one side. Elizabeth smiled at the recollection of all that she had heard of its inhabitants. Rosings Park is the home of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is the imperious patroness of Mr. Collins. He worships her. He licks her boots. He never stops talking about her. She's his next-door neighbor, right across the lane. As you're going to see, from a certain part of his property, he can look onto her property. And Elizabeth is smiling because he is such a toady to this woman, and at every point during his visit to Longbourn was so obsequious about her that she can't help but think it's kind of funny. At length the parsonage was discernible. The garden sloping to the road, the house standing in it, the green pales and the laurel hedge, everything declared they were arriving. Mr. Collins and Charlotte appeared at the door, and the carriage stopped at the small gate, which led by a short gravel walk to the house, amidst the nods and smiles of the whole party. In a moment they were all out of the chaise, rejoicing at the sight of each other. Mrs. Collins welcomed her friend with the liveliest pleasure, and Elizabeth was more and more satisfied with coming, when she found herself so affectionately received. She saw instantly that her cousin's manners were not altered by her marriage, that her cousin's manners, that is Mr. Collins, that his manners were not altered by his marriage. His formal civility was just what it had been, and he detained her some minutes at the gate to hear and satisfy his inquiries after all of her family. They were then, with no other delay than his pointing out the neatness of the entrance, taken into the house, and as soon as they were in the parlor, he welcomed them a second time with ostentatious formality to his humble abode, and punctually repeated all of his wife's offers of refreshment. There's a little theme running through here. I'm sure you've noticed it, but I'll point it out a little later on. Elizabeth was prepared to see him in his glory, and she could not help fancying that in displaying the good proportion of the room, its aspects and its furniture, he addressed himself particularly to her, as if wishing to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. She knows perfectly the bullet that she dodged, thank you very much. But though everything seemed neat and comfortable, she was not looking to gratify him by any sigh of repentance, and rather looked with wonder at her friend that she could have so cheerful an air with such a companion. When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might be reasonably ashamed, which certainly was not unseldom, she involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. Once or twice she could discern a faint blush, but in general Charlotte wisely did not hear. So this is happening multiple times. Mr. Collins is making a fool of himself multiple times. And every one of those times, Elizabeth can't help but look at Charlotte. How awkward is that? Control yourself, for Pete's sake. Her decision is made. You want to make things worse? Control yourself. Look at something else. Anyway. After sitting long enough to admire every article of furniture in the room, from the sideboard to the fender, to give an account of their journey and of all that had happened in London, Mr. Collins invited them to take a stroll in the garden, which was large and well laid out, and to the cultivation of which he attended himself. To this work in his garden was one of the most respectable pleasures, and Elizabeth admired the command of the countenance with which Charlotte talked of it, talked of the healthfulness of the exercise, and owned she encouraged it as much as possible. That's a little bit of side humor on Jane Austen's part. Might slip by in an age devoted to TikTok. The subtle dig there is that Charlotte encourages her husband to work in his garden often, so that he won't be in the house with her. Here, leading the way through every walk and crosswalk, and scarcely allowing them an interval to utter the praises he asked for, every view was pointed out with a minuteness which left beauty entirely behind. He could number the fields in every direction, and could tell you how many trees there were in the most distant clump. But of all the views which his garden, or which the county, or which the kingdom could boast, none were to be compared with the prospect of Rosings, afforded by an opening in the trees that bordered the park nearly opposite the front of his house. It was a handsome modern building, well situated in rising ground. So, two things there, since I appear to be interrupting at every paragraph. One, Mr. Collins is soulless. We knew this anyway. He has lovely grounds. There's another element of the grounds that you might have picked up on already. We'll get to it. But he has a lovely grounds. And it's lost on him completely. He knows all about it. He knows where everything is, but it leaves beauty behind. There is no concept of beauty here. In other words, he doesn't enjoy it for itself. And another little note there is that when we peek through that gap in the trees and look at Rosings Park, it's a modern building. It's new. Yet another indication that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is new money. From his garden, Mr. Collins would have led them round his 2 meadows, but the ladies, not having shoes to encounter the remains of a white frost, turned back. While Sir William accompanied him, Charlotte took her sister and friend over the house, extremely well pleased, probably, to have the opportunity of showing it without her husband's help. It was rather small, but well built and convenient, and everything was fitted up and arranged with a neatness and consistency of which Elizabeth gave Charlotte all the credit. When Mr. Collins could be forgotten, there really was a great air of comfort throughout, and by Charlotte's evident enjoyment of it, Elizabeth supposed that he must often be forgotten. She had already learnt that Lady Catherine was still in the country. It was spoken of again while they were at dinner, when Mr. Collins, joining in, observed, "Yes, Miss Elizabeth, you will have the honour of seeing Lady Catherine de Bourgh on the ensuing Sunday at church, and I need not say you will be delighted with her. She is all affability and condescension, and I doubt not but that you will be honoured with some portion of her notice when service is over. I have scarcely any hesitation in saying that she will include you and my sister Maria in every invitation with which she honours us during your stay here. Her behaviour to my dear Charlotte is charming. We dine at Rosings twice every week, and are never allowed to walk home. Her ladyship's carriage is regularly ordered for us, or I should say, one of her ladyship's carriages, for she has several." They're not that far away. It's not that long a walk, but they get the carriage treatment anyway. Lady Catherine is a very respectable, sensible woman indeed," added Charlotte, "and a most attentive neighbour." "Very true, my dear. That is exactly what I say." Yeah, it's exactly what Mr. Collins says, and I doubt very much that Charlotte is allowed to say anything other than what Mr. Collins says. She is the sort of woman whom one cannot regard with too much deference. The evening was spent chiefly in talking over Hertfordshire news and telling again what had already been written, and when it closed, Elizabeth, in the solitude of her chamber, had to meditate upon Charlotte's degree of contentment, to understand her address in guiding and composure in bearing with her husband, and to acknowledge that it was all done very well. She had also to anticipate how her visit would pass, the quiet tenor of their usual employments, the vexatious interruptions of Mr. Collins, and the gaieties of their intercourses with Rosings. A lively imagination soon settled it all. So this was the main import of this chapter was we all want to know how Charlotte is faring with this bargain that she struck with the devil. And Elizabeth is satisfied that at least she's doing it well. That's not very high praise. About the middle of the next day, as she was in her room getting ready for a walk, a sudden noise below seemed to speak the whole house in confusion, and after listening a moment, she heard somebody running up the stairs in a violent hurry and calling loudly after her. She opened the door and met Maria in the landing place, where, with breathless agitation, she cried out, "Oh, my dear Eliza, pray make haste and come into the dining room, for there is such a sight to be seen. I will not tell you what it is. Make haste and come down this moment." Elizabeth asked questions in vain, and Maria would tell her nothing more, and down they ran into the dining room, which fronted the lane, in quest of this wonder. It was 2 ladies stopping in a low phaeton at the garden gate. That is a light little carriage. "And is this all?" cried Elizabeth. "I expected at least that pigs were got into the garden, and here is nothing but Lady Catherine and her daughter." "Oh, my dear," said Maria, quite shocked at the mistake. "It is not Lady Catherine. The old lady is Mrs. Jenkinson, who lives with them. The other is Miss de Bourgh. Only look at her. She is quite a little creature. Who would have thought she could be so thin and small? She is abominably rude to keep Charlotte out of doors in all this wind. Why does she not come in? Oh, Charlotte says she hardly ever does. It is the greatest of favors when Mr. Berg comes in. I like her appearance, said Elizabeth, struck with other ideas. Remember, she has an axe to grind against Mr. Berg. Because as far as she's concerned, Mr. Berg is going to be Mr. Bingley's wife, not Jane. She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she will do for him very well. She will make him a very proper wife. Him being Mr. Bingley. She's looking now at this paragon of beauty and delicacy, for which she thinks Bingley has jilted Jane, and speaking in contempt. You're not supposed to speak in contempt of this wonder, who's a subject of astonishment for the whole house if she so much as stops at the gate. Mr. Collins and Charlotte were both standing at the gate in the conversation with the ladies, and Sir William, to Elizabeth's high diversion, was stationed in the doorway, in earnest contemplation of the greatness before him, and constantly bowing whenever Mr. Berg looked his way. He won't even go down the lane to the gate. He's standing in the doorway, and every time she happens to look at his direction, he does another ceremonious court bow. At length there was nothing more to be said, and the ladies drove on, and the others returned into the house. Mr. Collins no sooner saw the two girls than he began to congratulate them on their good fortune, which Charlotte explained by letting them know that the whole party was asked to dine at Rosings the next day. So, that's the end of the chapter. And Elizabeth might say, in the privacy of her chamber, that Charlotte is doing all of this very well, that she's playing the hostess very well, that she seems to have found ways to tolerate or endure her idiot husband, encourage him to be out of the house a lot, that when he's not there, she seems to perk up about her surroundings. But the picture is nevertheless painted that's pretty bleak. When she speaks of anything, she is repeating words that she has learned from her husband. And when this sickly little sister and her nursemaid, her teacher, her keeper, when they stop at the gate, well, okay, Mr. Collins is going to run down the yard and fawn over her as if it were some sort of natural marvel that he was seeing, and how it's a special mark of favor even for her to stop at the gate and exchange trivia of the day, much less for her to come up the walkway and visit the house. Not only is Mr. Collins doing that, but Charlotte Lucas is doing that, and you know, Jane Austen doesn't say it, but you know that she's under compulsion to do that. The Charlotte Lucas that we knew at Longbourn would not have cared about such a thing. She's under compulsion to do this. It cannot be pleasant. But in addition to that, since the main import of this whole chapter was for us all to know, Elizabeth, but also us as well, to learn how Charlotte is doing in this life that she chose for herself. How is she doing? Well, now we've seen Hunsford, which is the price that she won. It's the prize that she got from Mr. Collins. She certainly wasn't marrying him for himself. And what's the theme that runs throughout the chapter that we get over and over again, a variation of it over and over again? It's small. It's small. Mr. Collins has 2 fields, but the house itself is small. It's extremely modest. It's, in other words, just enough. It's just enough. It's not a thatched farmer's cottage. It's not that far removed from a thatched farmer's cottage. It's enough. I'm not saying that Charlotte Lucas had any right to hold out for more at age 28 and plain, but nevertheless, that's all she got from her bargain. That and being forced to parrot her husband's comments on everything and to kiss up to this neighboring family, even the sickly little girl. So it's a diverting chapter. It's got some good zingers in it, some very good zingers. Myself, I mean, there are subtle jokes all throughout here. I think the funniest thing, though, is that image of Sir William compulsively bowing every time this little girl looks his way. But not having the courage to actually go down the lane and talk to her himself. He doesn't have that much courage. It has a few things going on like that, but its main purpose was twofold. One was to give us all an idea of how Charlotte is doing. We saw her take the bargain that was offered to Elizabeth. So we want to know what that's like. And it's pretty bleak. It's not directly called bleak, but it seems pretty bleak to me. And the other thing that this chapter is supposed to do is get us to Rosings Park. Obviously, the next thing that's going to happen, the next big thing that's going to happen in this book, is that Elizabeth Bennet is going to meet the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. That is obviously the next thing. You'll notice who isn't mentioned in this chapter. Well, Mr. Bingley is hinted at, but Mr. Darcy is absent completely, as Elizabeth gets closer and closer to his own aunt. So, well, will that happen in the next chapter? Well, tune in and we'll find out together. Thank you.